The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. This is Unit 3. I just want to make sure that I'm being heard. So could I ask you just to look over in the question box there and could you just type in the word clear? That just lets me know I'm coming across loud and clear. Thank you. Thanks, John. Thanks, Margaret. Thanks, William. Thanks, Ted. Thanks, Jenny. Okay, it sounds like I am coming across loud and clear, which is great. As you know, of course, you can use the question box to make a statement or answer or ask a question during the course of the presentation. And don't forget, I'll be sending you a copy of the slides and the recording at the conclusion of this webinar. It may not be today, it may well be over the weekend, depending on how things pan out for me. All right, so let's get underway. So we're up to Unit 3 and we have so far looked at the characteristics of high-performing teams, and you might recall that I shared 8 of those characteristics with you. And then in Unit 2, which was 2 weeks ago, we looked at the 4 stages of team development, and you might recall they were forming, storming, norming, and performing. And the whole objective of that was for you as the leader to be aware of those different stages and some of the characteristics and do what you can as a leader to try to lead your team through the next stage. So that was essentially what that was about. And of course, today we're going to look at tools for leading teams. So if we just go back and recap what we did 2 weeks ago, you might recall that you would have seen this particular graph, and as you can see in front of you, you've got the 4 different stages that Tuckman talks about, and I really was talking about the different characteristics of each stage and what you need to do as a leader in order to lead people through that stage and onto the next stage. And I hope you've had a chance to observe your teams, and I hope you've had a chance to consider some of the strategies that I talked about in relation to moving your team on to the next phase. And that was essentially what that was about. And I did mention in the model that you can regress. For example, if you've got 2 or 3 new members in a team, it can change things quite dramatically, and you can go back to square one or wherever you need, or perhaps even a stage before. So the model is linear in a sense, but in another sense you can regress through a variety of circumstances. All right, so what are we going to be doing today? Well, essentially there's a couple of things that we're going to look at. We're going to look at the business of task and relationship, and as you could probably imagine in your team, you've got 2 broad dimensions to look after. Obviously, you've got to get the task done or tasks done. There are a range of tasks that your team are required to achieve, but all the while you've also got to look after the relationships in the team and try and create a climate where relationships can flourish. And having those 2 balls in the air at once is very, very important, because without doing that, of course, you won't have an optimal performing team. And this requires you to be flexible, and it means that at some stages you need to be very task focused, and other stages you need to be very relationship focused. And what I want to do is give you a sense of when that might be during the course of our hour together. And I'm going to share with you the situational leadership model, which is Hershey and Blanchard's model, and it's just a nice model to be able to consider how you can adjust your leadership style. So the objective of today's session is for you as a leader to be flexible in your leadership style depending on the circumstances you're facing at the time. And that's essentially what we're trying to do here during our time together. All right, now one of the models that I think is always useful and quite entertaining is this model of stages of learning. And I just want to run through it with you. You may well have seen it before, but I think the stages of learning in any team are fairly straightforward. And of course, the stages of learning for you individually are fairly straightforward too. And I'll use the analogy of learning to drive a car to make my point. So you notice there on the top right-hand corner, you've got a number of stages. You've got unconscious incompetent, conscious incompetent, conscious competent, unconscious competent, and then mastery. So unconscious competent really means, in plain English, you don't know that you don't know. You're ignorant. You're not aware that there's learning to be had. Conscious incompetence means that I'm aware that I need to learn, but I'm not quite sure where to start or what to do, but I've got to put some effort in to make the necessary changes in learning. Conscious competence means that I've got to be aware of the learning, and it's not straightforward at that stage, and it takes a little bit of time to learn the skills. And what you want to get to, of course, is a stage of unconscious competence. That is where it's just second nature. And by second nature, it means that you don't have to concentrate much on what you're doing. It becomes fairly straightforward. And of course, that leads to mastery. So if you think about the analogy of driving a car, and I vividly recall this when I learned to drive in the first instance, most teenagers, of course, at the early stages, before they've got behind the wheel, see themselves, well, they are at that unconscious incompetent stage. In other words, they think that it's pretty straightforward. All I've got to do is get behind the wheel and away I go. And I can vividly recall the first time that happened, and I remember reversing out of the garage, and instead of putting my foot on the brake, I had my foot on the accelerator in reverse, which isn't a good thing to do. And I ended up, landing in a bunch of trees. I didn't do much damage to the car, fortunately. But, of course, that taught me a very important lesson. And what happened at that point is I moved from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence. So all of a sudden I knew that I didn't know. I realized there was more to this than meets the eye. And in fact, I was quite receptive at that point to have driving lessons. And teenagers go through that stage. And of course, once I had driving lessons, I had to be very mindful that I had to look in the rear vision mirror. I had to, look in the side mirrors. I had to be conscious of oncoming traffic. I had to be conscious of what was behind me. All the things we have to do when we're driving a car. But I had to do that in a conscious, competent stage. So in other words, it was hard work. And then, of course, after a while, once you get your license and you've been driving for, say, 10 years, then things become unconscious. You become unconsciously competent. In other words, it's fairly second nature. Things are pretty straightforward. You don't seem to think too much about it in a conscious level, and unconsciously you just drive. And ultimately what happens is that you become a master of your driving, hopefully. Not, of course, some people would argue that you never become a master of that, but nevertheless, we go through those stages. And I think as you're learning through the Lunch and Learn series, the same sort of principles apply. It's just there's a different form of learning. And so it's very important to be aware of that as you go through the process. And I guess you're obviously moved out of the unconscious incompetent stage. You realize that there are things that you need to learn. You wouldn't be doing the Lunch and Learn series otherwise. And I'm hoping you're getting to the stage of being consciously competent, and then ultimately it becomes second nature. So I just share that model with you because I think it's really important to consider learning in that framework and to consider those stages. All right, so as I said earlier, there are two broad dimensions to what you do in the workplace. One of those dimensions, of course, is getting the tasks done that are required in your team, irrespective of what they might be, and all the while maintaining good, robust working relationships. And these are the dual responsibilities of any team leader. And of course, if you neglect one and spend too much time on the other, then it's likely that your team is not going to be performing at an optimal level. So for example, if you're very task focused and you ignore the relationship element in your team, it's likely that it's going to lead to a lack of trust and you're going to have problems completing the tasks. On the other hand, if you're too relationship focused and not task focused, then nothing really gets done, but everybody's happy working with each other. After a while, of course, they won't be happy because nothing gets done. So this is a balancing act between two things that we need to be aware of. And of course, it becomes a little bit more complex than that in this sense that really you can split up the task dimension, of course, is straightforward. That's technically what you do, but you can split up the relationship dimension into two subcategories. That is team relationships and individual relationships. So let's look at those very briefly. So individual relationships is your one-on-one professional working relationship with each member of your team. Now, law of averages would be that if you've only got, if you say 5 people in your team, it's likely that one of those relationships probably isn't exactly where it needs to be. Maybe no fault of your own, but nevertheless, that's a relationship, an individual relationship that has to be worked on. But all the while, you've also got a whole bunch of other relationships going on in your team. That is the relationship between the individual team members and how they conduct themselves and how they communicate with each other. And those sorts of things you do have some control over. That is creating a climate where people are willing to work together in a team. So it becomes even more complex. So you've got 3 basic balls that you're juggling: task, team, and individual. And it's important that you keep all of those balls in the air at the same time and not drop any of them. But of course we all do at times, and we're aware of that. So that's the focus of what we're going to look at over the next 45 minutes or thereabouts. And within the task, it's basically what you do. So obviously that's the nature of the work that you do, and probably you got promoted to be in charge of a team because you have got good task knowledge and good task skill. So really that shouldn't be an issue. Probably where the issues may be for you is catering for individual needs, interests and motivations. And your job, of course, as a team leader is to try and get the very best out of the people you lead. And of course, as you would know, that's an elusive, difficult task. It sounds easy, it's not that easy. And of course, the final aspect, as I mentioned before, was the team component. That is, all the while maintaining some harmony, some balance, and collaborating with your team when you need to collaborate with them, and not collaborating with them when you shouldn't collaborate with them, and knowing when to do each is important. So being a team leader is quite complex, and it requires a lot of thought, and it requires a lot of energy and a lot of insight. So that's the topic of what we're going to be looking at today. Now, I'm going to share with you several models throughout the course of this presentation, and I'm going to share with you some models that have stood the test of time. Now, this first model is Blake's managerial grid, and what you're seeing in front of you there is you can see that on the left-hand side there is a concern for people, and down the bottom there's a concern for productivity or production. Now, so you can plot your leadership style on this model. So you might want to think about which box you're in. So it's a 2x2 matrix, a typical sort of scenario. So let's start with people who have a high concern, or team leaders that have a high concern for people but a low concern for productivity. These are what we might call the country club, or what Blake calls the country club. In other words, everyone's very happy but nothing really gets done. Now, I'm not a member of a country club, but I'm assuming that not much that gets done in a country club. But of course, there's all sorts of networking and relationships that go on in a country club. So if we go down to the bottom here, the bottom left-hand corner, we've got a lack of concern for people and a lack of concern for production. And we'd call this an impoverished leader. In other words, they really are a reluctant team leader. They're not really interested in being part of leading the team. They're just hoping that people have got the discipline and know how to go ahead and do things themselves. So a classic example of that would be a lab technician who's very technically qualified, who is working with a number of other lab technicians, but they happen to be the leader of the team. And they get buried so much in their work that they don't pay much attention to the productivity of their colleagues, nor the relationships that their colleagues have with each other. And that would be an example of an impoverished leader. Now, if we go over to the right-hand side and have a look at this one here is a high concern for production and a low concern for people, and this would be a task-focused. And I find lots of team leaders that fit into this category. So very good on organising tasks, knows what needs to be done, delegates authority, delegates work to people, but because they ignore the relationship dimension, often things unravel at certain times throughout the course of their leadership because they're not spending much time working on the relationships in the team. So the final one here, which may seem to be the ideal one, which is team management. Now, this is where there's a high concern for people and a high concern for task. And, so we've got an equal weighting there with a strong emphasis on both. Now, you might think, well, that's the best one there, surely. Well, it is in most cases. And then you've got one more here, which is a middle of the road. Now, the middle of the road one is perhaps where people should consider themselves, because if you're a 5-5, in other words, you're in the middle of the road, it means that you can fluctuate very quickly and easily to what's required. So at certain times, for example, when there are deadlines that need to be met, you need to be far more focused on production because of the deadlines. So therefore, you can easily go into that box of task. But at other times, say for example, when morale is low, it might well be that you need to be the country club style leader. That is, building and nurturing relationships in your team because of the morale issue in your team. So you don't, of course, want to be in the impoverished box, because I can't see any reason for that unless you've got a very mature team and a team that knows exactly what they're doing and they don't want to be interfered with. And then you've got the team management one, which is probably a good one to consider. So that's one way of looking at the balance between task and relationship. And I'm going to share, as I said, a number of different models like that. But Blake's model, the managerial grid, is a good starting point to consider where you need to spend more time and more energy with your team. Now, Kurt Lewin was one of the first. Kurt Lewin, of course, is a legendary management consultant, and he came up with the concept that basically there are 3 styles of leadership that are important. And I think they're still very relevant today. He argued that leaders could be autocratic, laissez-faire, or democratic. And of course, it would very much depend on the circumstances that you're in. So, for example, if we take the first one, which is autocratic, this is, of course, where the leader makes the decisions and basically delegates it to the team members to get the job done. Now, a classic example of that, of course, would be in the military during a war where they have to make quick decisions, and they have to make those decisions and pass them down to their team or squadron or whatever it is. So that would be an example in an emergency where being an autocratic style of leader would be a very acceptable way of dealing with things. Now, if we go right over to the other side and talk about the democratic style of leadership, that's where the leader consults with his or her team before making a decision. So they are pretty much consultative. And a good example of that would be, of course, a manager in a professional services firm. So a manager in a professional services firm, say, for example, a group of, let's say, lawyers, managers in those sorts of examples They all know what they need to do. They've all got their own client base, and as a result of that, the leader really needs to consult with the team in terms of coordination and so forth. And a democratic style of leadership would be probably quite suited, assuming, of course, that those professionals were very well motivated and knew what they were doing, and in most cases they do. So that would be an example of a democratic style of leadership. Now, the third one, which is the most interesting one of all, is what is called the laissez-faire style of leadership. Laissez-faire is the French word meaning free and easy. And laissez-faire leaders, what they tend to do is to allow the team to make the decisions and be available on a needs basis. So an example of that would be a court of law, certainly in this country at least, where the jury will actually make a decision about someone's guilt or innocence. So they'll go away and they'll consult, they'll look at the evidence, they'll consider and weigh up the pros and cons of the arguments from the prosecution and the defence, and ultimately they'll come back and give their verdict on the guilt or innocence of the person before the court. But the judge in those examples is actually using laissez-faire leadership, because often the jury will want to consult with the judge on points of law. So there'll be times when the judge will consult with the jury, and they'll do that as a way of getting some expert knowledge from that particular judge, so that they'll know what particular evidence to focus on. So this is a style of leadership that you very readily see in courts. So the power base for the autocratic leader is their position. So they have a hierarchy or a ranking. The power base for the democratic style of leader is fairness. So they are willing to engage and involve everyone in equal terms. And the power base for the laissez-faire leader is expertise. And that's why the team will consult the leader, because they have a certain degree of expertise that is required in certain situations. So, your style of leadership, of course, using Lewin's model, is actually really around varying your style depending on who you're leading and what the situation is. So in times of crisis or deadlines, or where time is of essence, you'd probably want to be autocratic, because you've got no time to consult and you don't have the luxury for that, and somebody's ultimately got to make the decision. For times when you want to take the team with you and engage them in the process of leadership, you'd want to be democratic. And at times where you believe that the team has a sufficient maturity to make up their own mind and make their own decisions, you may well want to be laissez-faire. So I would suggest to you that perhaps 60% of your time should be spent in democratic, 20% in autocratic, and 20% in laissez-faire, depending, of course, on what you do, who you lead, and what your own expertise might be. So that's another very good model, because it's simple to understand, it's easy to get your head around, and I think that that's one thing that you might like to consider, is to be able to fluctuate between the three. And in fact, if I went up to your team and I asked them, if I had an opportunity and I said, look, I'm working with your leader in a lunch and learn program, and I'm just trying to get a little handle on what style of leadership they use, and I shared this model with them, and I said, which of those three do you think? What you don't want is for them to say, oh no, they're definitely autocratic, or they're definitely laissez-faire, or they're definitely democratic. In other words, what it means is that your style is inflexible rather than flexible. So what you've got to try and do is be as flexible as you possibly can, depending on the task that you're dealing with and the people that you're dealing with. So that's a great model. It was certainly one of the first models that came up around leadership style, and it certainly makes a lot of sense. I'm sure you've all seen these sorts of models around the difference between a manager and a leader, and I won't go through each one of these. It's a very busy slide. Of course, you'll get a copy of this later on, but essentially what it's basically saying is there is a distinction between managing and leading, and the distinction is sometimes subtle, but sometimes it's not. But I'll just perhaps deal with a couple of these just to give you a kind of an insight into some of those. So you've got managers will tend to administer, whereas leaders, of course, will tend to innovate. A manager will copy and a leader will be original. So you've got this dichotomy, and what we're strongly recommending through this Lunch and Learn series is for you to practice some of the skills on the right-hand side, which is very much around leadership. And it doesn't mean that you should disband the things that are managerial, because obviously they're critically important. Some of those things, all of those things in the right place at the right time are important. For example, the third from the bottom, you need to keep your eye on the bottom line. You need to manage budgets. That's a managerial responsibility. But you also need your eye on the horizon. So you need to be able to sort of have a vision about what's coming next and be able to paint a compelling picture of the future for your team members. So that's another model that you might find very useful in terms of the dichotomy between management and leader. And so I'm not suggesting you should be one or the other. Actually, what I am suggesting is that you should be both. But what I find most people do in a team leadership role is that they'll tend to be more the manager than the leader, but that your team expect you to be a leader as much as a manager. So it's important to be both. And I'm just giving you food for thought to think, well, which am I and how might I go about my business? Are there any questions, comments, observations at this stage that anyone would like to share with the group? Bearing in mind, if you type a question in, I'm the only one that gets to see the answer, but I'll certainly read it out and we'll deal with it. So can I ask you to have a think about some of those questions that you might want to ask at this stage? All right, I won't pause now. If you've got one, I'll see it come up. Now, another way of looking at this whole notion of task and relationship is a model that I really like, which is Tannenbaum's model. And basically, you'll notice that over on the top left-hand side, it's very much manager-oriented. So very much the manager is the dominant person in the arrangement. Whereas over on the right-hand side, it's very much team-oriented. So as you move from left to right, the team are taking more shared ownership and responsibility for decision making. And the further you go to the left, the more the onus of responsibility for leading is left with you. So what's interesting is down the bottom, you've got a number of different positions that you can take. And I guess this work is built very much on Lewin's model. So if you look at, for example, if we start at the bottom over on the left-hand side, you can see that the very first position that you might be able to take is that the manager makes the decision and announces it to the team. So obviously that's an autocratic style according to Lewin. So there'll be times when it's important for you to convey information that has been given to you from your manager, which is a fait accompli. There is no argument about it. It has to be done. And as a result of that, your job in a team meeting is to communicate that information. So that would be an example where you would use that position. It's very much dependent on the quality of information that you share. As we move across from left to right, the manager might sell the decision. So not only would you communicate the decision to others, but you'd sell the benefits for them and perhaps the disadvantages to people for not taking a position. So this is where you might need to sell a benefit. So for example, there might be a new system that you're implementing in your workplace that really has come from above. There is no choice, but you do want to sell the benefits of the new system, basically because other people may not be so committed to the new system. So they need to understand what's in it for them. So these two positions, the first two that I've gone through, would very much neatly fit into Kurt Lewin's autocratic style of leadership. Then as we move to the next, which is the third one, this is where you present decisions present the decision with ideas, and you invite questions. So at this stage, you might involve the team in some conversation and questions and decisions around the implementation of a system. And so if you're inviting questions and that leads to a conversation with your team members around the table, then it's likely to fall into this bracket. Now, if the manager suggests a provisional decision and invites discussion about it, he or she might be testing the water to determine whether or not that decision is going to be well received by the team members. And the leader in their mind is probably thinking to themselves, well, we'll see how this goes. If the team are committed to it, we'll fall into line. But if they're not, we'll throw it out. So that's very much a middle of the road and a democratic style of leadership, according to Kurt Lewin's model that I shared with previously. And then as we go to the blue arrow, this is where the manager presents a situation and gets suggestions and ideas from the team members. So this would be where the leader wants the team completely engaged in the solution, so much so that they're asking for people to make suggestions about how they might ultimately deal with a problem that's facing the team. Now, the leader at that point could make a decision about how he or she wants to progress based on that feedback. So the leader ultimately still has the final say, but the team are actually engaged in the discussion about what might be appropriate. So it means that the leader is receptive and open to the suggestions and ideas of the team. So again, that's very much a democratic style of leadership. And the next dimension, which is the green bar, is where the manager explains, defines the parameters, and asks the team to decide. So, for example, the leader might put a problem on the table in your own work area and say, this is what we're facing. I'd be keen to discuss with you how we might go about achieving this. Has anyone got some ideas about how we might go forward? And ultimately, what the leader is doing is giving the big picture, that is the final result that he or she wants, and asking the team to make a decision about or make some choices about how they might achieve that. So the green bar there is obviously the laissez-faire style of leadership. And the final one there, as you can see, is the manager allows the team to develop some options and decide on actions within the manager's required limits. So the manager might give people, say, by the end of the week to make a decision, and a good example of that would be rostering. So we're in a busy period. We need to work out when people are available and when they're not. And so the leader leaves it to the team to try and sort through and work through that rather than take that responsibility on themselves. So they set up a challenge and they say to the team, can you as a team get together, work out who's available, when they're available, and come up with a plan and present it to me by the end of the week so that I can start to allocate resources and so forth for that. So that would be a good example of where you would use a laissez-faire style of responsibility. And ultimately, the team are the ones that will come back, hopefully, with something that's workable for the manager. And obviously, if they come back and it's not workable, then the manager can go to the further to the left on the model and then make the decision, having consulted the team, found that they haven't got the decision that they want, and ultimately make the decision. So I think this is another good model for you to think about, that depending on the situation that you're in and the people you're dealing with, you can be any of these things at any stage. Where you're working with a highly motivated, highly competent team, I might point out, you don't want to be too much on the left-hand side because you've got a highly motivated and competent team, it's likely that you would want them to have the freedom and responsibility to make up the decisions because they've demonstrated that they're capable and willing to do it that way. So you can see that the leader in this example has to flex and change depending on the circumstances that they face. All right, so that's another model that you might find quite useful in terms of the way that you balance this task and balance this relationship. So if you think about it, the further to the left you are, the more task focused you are, and the further to the right, the more people focused you are, in the sense that you're getting your team to ultimately take responsibility for the leadership. In other words, we call this shared leadership. So that's another model that you may consider. Now, the model that often we see, and it's very popular, is Hershey and Blanchard's situational leadership model. And I'm sure you've seen this somewhere along the way. And I think it's a great model because what this model does is it takes into consideration the maturity of the team. So in other words, if you think about how motivated your team are and how motivated and committed they are on the one hand, generally speaking, and how competent they are in terms of completing the tasks, the concept is that on that basis, you will adjust and flex your leadership style depending on the circumstances. So, for example, if you look at D4, D4, of course, is where we have categorized our team generally as highly competent and highly committed. So they're very competent, very committed. They know what they're doing and they're completely committed to the goal at hand. So if you've got a team, generally speaking, in that realm, then what Blanchard and Hershey are saying is that you should be spending your time delegating and supporting. Delegating because you know that the job's going to get done, and perhaps you might even adjust your style to be supporting. So in other words, the door will be open, people are available to talk to you if and when they get into some sort of a problem. So that's where a good leader will flex their style depending on that. Now, if we go to the other end of the extreme, and this is D1, D1 is low competence and high commitment. So, sorry, that's not an extreme, that's one example. That's where they've got low competence and high commitment. Now, the typical example there would be a young team who are enthusiastic about what they're doing. They're very, very enthusiastic about achieving their goals and whatever is required, but they don't have a breadth of experience. And because they don't have a breadth of experience, they really don't know what they don't know. It comes back to that original model that I shared with you. They're unconsciously incompetent. All right? That doesn't mean they're not enthusiastic. They just don't know that they don't know. They don't have the breadth of knowledge and so forth. And because they don't have the breadth of knowledge, this requires you as a leader to be more directive, to be more autocratic, if you like, because they need that. And I think some people make a big mistake when they're working with millennials in the workplace and make the assumption that they want to be engaged in everything, and so what the leader does is they tend not to be as directive as they probably should. Now, by directive, I don't mean unfriendly. I mean just being straight to the point and ultimately taking the responsibility yourself. And in fact, if you do that right, people who have a low skill level will appreciate that if it's done in the right way. And of course, that's what should happen. So for example, if you've got a new team member who comes into your team who clearly doesn't know much about the work at hand but has a high level of enthusiasm, it would be a good idea for you to be reasonably directive in those early stages up to probation. So this model can be used for individual leadership and also for team leadership. And D2 is where you've got low to some competence, but low commitment. So if there's low commitment and some skill, then coaching is the right way to go, particularly one-on-one coaching. Sitting down with people, giving them a picture of what you want to achieve, building on what they've contributed to the conversation, and basically giving them some tasks to achieve, and being perhaps in close proximity when they're achieving those tasks. And D3, of course, is moderate to high competence, but variable commitment. Well, that might require you to be supporting your team. So some people might want a pat in the back, some people might need a kick in the backside. There's a whole range of possibilities there depending on the variation of the commitment in the team. So you can see that what Hershey and Blanchard are really saying is that we should be delegating, supporting, coaching and directing depending on who we're dealing with, as well as, of course, what we're dealing with. So I guess what I'm trying to say to you all here in this session is that your job as a team leader is to become as flexible as you can. And I guess the important point is, and I've got a question here actually, someone says, how do you know which one should be used? Thanks, Catherine, for the question. Sometimes you don't know. Sometimes you don't know which one of those to use. And if you're put in a position where that's the case, then you try something. And if you find it's not working, then you move to another box. You move to another quadrant. You try something else. And if you vary your style, you will soon find your niche. You'll find your mark. So sometimes it's not possible to work out where you should be. The other point, of course, and I think this is innate in the question, is that you've probably got a team where there's some very experienced people. You've got some people where there perhaps aren't experienced people. You've got some high commitment, low commitment. You've got a mixed bag, basically. So if that's the case, then obviously what you've got to try and do in your one-on-one interactions with each team member, that's the relationship part, remember, you've got to be prepared to vary your style. So that what it means is that, sometimes you're delegating, sometimes you're supporting, sometimes you're coaching, and sometimes you're directing. And if you do it, if you vary your style like that, it becomes fairly easy to use those. But the worst thing is to become typecast into one of these 4 different styles. The key for you is to try to be as varying as you can. And I guess you probably can work out what your homework's going to be. And that is to vary your style depending on the situation and the circumstances this afternoon and next week and the week after and so forth. I want you to try consciously to be as flexible as you possibly can in terms of being able to balance the task and the relationship. So it will require a range of different approaches from you. And one of those approaches, even though it's quite possible that you feel comfortable doing one of these 4 things, the truth of the matter is that just because you feel comfortable doing it doesn't necessarily mean it's right. So you've got to take into account 3 things. You've got to take into account your personal style, which I think it'd probably be fairly easy for you to work out. You've got to take into account the tasks that you're dealing with. And you've also got to take into account the relationships. So, who am I dealing with? What are their skill level? What's their commitment level? And of course, these things ebb and flow, particularly commitment. So skill perhaps doesn't change too much in the short term, at least. Commitment can, and that can vary. So the key for you is to try the different approaches as much as you possibly can. Do we have any other questions that people would like to ask me at this stage before we wrap up? So I'm hoping that what I'm giving you here is a framework, and it's an opportunity for you to start to really evaluate your own style and to start to think about broadening it and to use and exercise as many different styles as you can. And as I said before, if it doesn't work, if plan A doesn't work, then just move to a plan B or a C or a D, depending on who it is or what it is. And by doing that, you will find your niche and you'll find the opportunities to lead. Okay, so there's a lot of books and information out there that suggests as leaders we've got to be very empowering. Well, that's true. It is important to be empowering, and in other words, engage other people in the action. And of course it's important, but there is always a time and a place for us to be quite directive, or what Lewin calls autocratic. I'll give you a classic example of that. I was working in an orchestra, and the manager of that orchestra was highly relationship focused, perhaps too relationship focused. And I was observing this meeting, and I was just sitting in the room, and he had in the room all the section principals, which are the leaders of their various sections in the orchestra. And he made an announcement, and he said that one of the players had received an opportunity to work with another orchestra, which is not uncommon, of course, in the world of music. And he asked people what he thought he should do about that. Now, people come and go in orchestras, and they get all sorts of opportunities, as I mentioned, to work in different orchestras. And one of the principals in the room, that is one of the leaders, said, just make a decision. Just make a decision. That's what you get paid to do. Our input in this means nothing. Really, you should be the one making the call. So what basically the principal was saying is that you don't need to consult us on that situation. That's something that you've got to decide on. And if you do make the decision, then we'll back you. And I thought that was very interesting. So in other words, the team was actually saying to the leader, we need you to be more directive and not to consider consulting us in those occasions where it's obvious that it's already happened. So your job is to be as flexible as you possibly can. If plan A doesn't work, try plan B or C or D, depending on the circumstances. So your homework in the next fortnight is pretty straightforward, but challenging nevertheless in some respects. And that is, I want you to take some time and consider one of the tools that you've learnt today. Of course, you'll be getting these slides shortly, and I'd like you to apply it for a day. So I want you to actually practice some of the different skills and different ways of doing things. I'd like you to reflect on that. I'd like you to consider what's working and what's not working. I'd like you to vary your style and your approach depending on the circumstances. In short, I want you to be aware of task and relationship. And what I'm hoping that you will be able to do is to be more flexible than you currently are in terms of the way you deal with people and situations. So that's going to be your homework for the next fortnight. And when we meet again, which will be in Unit 4 in December, we're going to talk about the roles that people play in teams. Now, I've got a special guest who'll be joining us for that, who's an expert in this area. And we're going to talk about the fact that people play certain roles in teams. And some of these roles, of course, are subconscious. They're not aware of it. Of course, one of the roles is to do the job they need to do that's on their job description. But this is more than that. People will come to a team with a certain way of thinking, and they'll express that. And if we can harness that more effectively, then what it means is that we can then call on that person at the right time in the right place. And then in Unit 5, I've got a diagnostic for you to complete, which is on conflict, because clearly when you're dealing with a team, it's likely that there's going to be negotiations and conflict that go on in the team. And your job is to work through that. And there's a range of different ways of doing that. And what the survey will show you is your preferred style. And then we'll finish up in Unit 6 next year on developing team culture. So folks, if there's no questions at this stage, and it doesn't look as if there are, I might finish up and we can finish at that point. So it doesn't look like there is. So thank you everyone, I wish you a really wonderful weekend, and I wish you well in concentrating on using those different models of task and relationship more effectively in your workplace. Thank you, and until the next unit, I wish you well. Have a great weekend. Thank you, and goodbye.